My husband found out about my pregnancy and said, "This is not my child. I need a DNA test." I replied, "Of course, darling." He didn't know that my lawyer was already holding the divorce papers. When the results came, he fell to his knees. Good day, dear listeners. It's Beverly again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. Looking back now, I can see exactly where the cracks were. I just didn't want to. Derek and I had been married for 6 years when everything fell apart. 6 years in a tan brick colonial in Buckhead, Atlanta. The kind of neighborhood where people wave to each other from driveways and pretend everything is fine. We had matching SUVs, a golden retriever named Chester, and a joint savings account that looked impressive on paper. From the outside, we were the couple people pointed to at dinner parties. They make it work, someone once said about us. I smiled and refilled my wine glass. I was a senior editor at a mid-size publishing house downtown. Derek was a financial manager at Mercer Capital, the kind of job that required a lot of late evenings and apparently a lot of trust from a wife who asked too few questions. I worked long hours, too. We were both busy. That was the excuse I gave myself every time I noticed something that didn't sit right. The first warning sign came about 8 months before everything exploded. Derek started sleeping with his phone face down. It was such a small thing, the kind of thing you could dismiss in a second if you wanted to, and I wanted to. I told myself he was probably just dealing with a stressful client. He was always dealing with stressful clients. Then came the cologne, a different brand, subtle, just enough that I noticed it when he came home one Thursday evening. When I mentioned it, he said the office had a gift basket from a vendor. I nodded. I believed him, or I told myself I did. Then there were the weekends, golf games that ran long, a work conference in Charlotte that I later found out lasted 1 day, not 2, a quietness in him, not hostile, just distant, like he was somewhere else even when he was sitting right next to me on the couch. I remember reaching for his hand one Sunday morning and him not pulling away, but not holding back either, just allowing it. Like I was a stranger he was being polite to. I should have acted then, but I didn't. Because the truth is, when you've built a life with someone, you develop a powerful talent for not seeing things. I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday in March. I was in the bathroom of our house, alone, Chester scratching at the door from the hallway. 2 pink lines. My hands were shaking, but not entirely from fear. There was something else underneath it. Something complicated, something that felt almost like hope. We had talked about children early in our marriage. Derek had wanted them. I had wanted them. Somewhere along the way, those conversations had stopped without either of us formally ending them. I told him that evening, after dinner. I'd set the table properly, lit a candle, made his favorite, braised short ribs. I don't know what I expected. Surprise, certainly. Maybe panic, maybe joy. What I did not expect was what I got. He looked at the positive test I placed beside his plate. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up at me, and his face had shifted into something I had never seen before. Not surprise, something colder. "That's not my baby," he said. "I want a DNA test." The words landed like something physical. I felt them in my chest, in my stomach, behind my eyes. I sat across from him at the table we'd bought together at an estate sale 4 years ago, under the light of a candle I'd lit to make the moment feel special, and I heard my husband tell me, with the same calm voice he used to discuss mortgage rates, that he did not believe our child was his. Did he even hear what he was saying? Did he understand what those words meant? I looked at him for a long moment. Chester had stopped scratching at the door. The house was very quiet. "Okay, sweetheart," I said. "That's fine." And I smiled. What Derek didn't know, what he couldn't have known in that moment, was that before I'd made dinner, before I'd set the table and lit the candle, I had already placed a call, not to my mother, not to Dana, to Margaret Osei, a family law attorney whose card had been sitting in the back of my desk drawer for 3 weeks. 3 weeks because somewhere in the part of me I'd been ignoring, I had already known. Derek picked up his fork and continued eating. He thought the conversation was over. It was only just beginning. I didn't sleep that night. Derek did. He went to bed at his usual time, 10:15, and I lay beside him in the dark, listening to his breathing slow and steady into sleep. And I thought, how does a person do that? How do you say what he said and then just close your eyes? I got up around midnight and went downstairs. I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, just the glow of the street lamp coming through the window, and I let myself feel it, all of it, the humiliation of it. That was the first wave. 6 years. 6 years of building something together. And the first thing he reached for when I told him I was carrying our child was doubt. Not concern, not confusion, accusation. Clean and immediate, like it had been waiting there, loaded. The second wave was grief, and that surprised me. I wasn't grieving him exactly. I think I had already started losing him without realizing it. I was grieving the version of my life I had been protecting, the version where the tan brick colonial and the matching SUVs actually meant something, where the man sleeping upstairs was the man I had married. The third wave was fear, because I was 34 years old, pregnant, and the father of my child had just told me, over braised short ribs, that he didn't believe it was his. What did that mean legally? What did that mean financially? We had a joint mortgage, joint accounts. My name was tied to his in a dozen invisible ways. If this marriage was ending, and by midnight I knew with cold clarity that it was, I needed to understand what I was standing on before the ground gave way. I went to my desk and opened the drawer. Margaret Osei's card was still there. I had picked it up 3 weeks earlier from a friend who'd gone through a divorce and described Margaret as the kind of woman who doesn't lose. I told myself I was keeping it just in case. But you don't keep a divorce lawyer's card in your desk drawer because everything is fine. I texted her at 12:40 in the morning. I need to move forward. Can we meet this week? She responded at 7 the next morning. Thursday, 9 a.m., my office. Bring everything you can access. I spent Wednesday doing what Margaret had asked. I made copies, quietly, carefully, of our joint financial statements, the mortgage documents, Derek's most recent tax returns, which I had access to because we filed jointly. I photographed the contents of his home filing cabinet while he was at the gym. I noted the account numbers, the investment portfolios, the statements from Mercer Capital that outlined his compensation structure. I was systematic about it. I had spent 12 years as an editor. I knew how to organize information, how to find what mattered in a stack of paper. And I thought about the baby. I want to be honest about something. The pregnancy wasn't planned. We hadn't been trying. But Derek and I were still, at least technically, a married couple. And the idea that he could look at me with that cold expression and say that's not my baby told me everything I needed to know about what he had been doing when he wasn't home. Because you don't say that, not to your wife of 6 years, not unless you have a reason to already believe the relationship has become something other than what it's supposed to be. His accusation was, in its own way, a confession. I didn't cry in front of him. In those days, between the dinner and my Thursday meeting with Margaret, I was careful, polite. I made coffee in the mornings. I asked about his day. I was the version of Rachel that Derek had stopped paying attention to, which meant he didn't notice anything had changed. He was relieved, I think, that I hadn't made a scene. He probably thought I was processing. He probably thought he'd won something. Margaret's office was on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown, all glass and clean lines. She was a small woman in her 50s, Ghanaian American, with reading glasses on a chain, and the kind of stillness that made you feel like she had seen every version of every story, and was not impressed by any of them. She listened to me for 40 minutes without interrupting. Then she took off her glasses, set them on the desk, and said, "You came prepared. That helps. Here's what we're going to do." She explained my rights under Georgia family law, the property, the assets, the pregnancy, which would complicate and also strengthen certain aspects of the case. She told me about the DNA test, that I could legally agree to one, and that the results would carry their own weight in court. She told me that Derek's request, while painful, was not unusual in contested paternity situations, but that the manner in which he delivered it, the immediate unqualified accusation, suggested he had reason to believe the marriage had already broken down in ways that predated my pregnancy. "Has he been faithful?" she asked me. I thought of the cologne, the Charlotte conference, the phone face down on the nightstand. "I don't know," I said, "but I think I need to find out." Margaret nodded. "Then let's find out," she said, "because if he hasn't been, that changes the narrative entirely." I drove home that afternoon with a folder of papers on the passenger seat and something new in my chest. Not hope exactly, more like direction. I had been drifting in that house for months, pretending not to see things. Now I had a map, and I had a lawyer who didn't lose. The divorce papers were drafted the following week. Margaret worked quickly. I had given her everything she needed, the financial documents, the account records, the mortgage details, and she built the filing around them with the kind of precision I'd always admired in a clean manuscript. Georgia is an equitable distribution state, she reminded me, which meant the court would divide marital assets fairly, not necessarily equally, and given the length of our marriage and my contribution to joint finances, the picture was not unfavorable. She also told me to say nothing to Derek. Nothing about the lawyer, nothing about the papers, nothing that would cause him to start moving money or consulting his own attorney before we were ready. "Let him think you're still processing," she said. "Silence is a strategy." So I stayed silent. I went home each evening and I was the same quiet, undemanding Rachel I had apparently become so good at being. Derek barely looked up from his laptop. He had taken to working in the study after dinner, door half closed, and I no longer asked why. It was Patricia who first felt something shift. My mother-in-law had always been the sharper of the two. Derek inherited his confidence from her, that easy assumption that the world would arrange itself around his preferences. Patricia Hayes was a retired school administrator from Marietta, tall, silver-haired, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. She had never openly disliked me, but I had always felt her measuring me against some standard she had never bothered to share. She called Derek on a Wednesday evening. I was in the kitchen and I heard his side of the conversation through the partially open study door. "She's fine, Mom. She's been calm, actually." A pause. "No, I don't know why. Maybe she's coming around to it." Another pause. Longer. "I'll keep an eye on it." He came into the kitchen afterward and looked at me for a moment. Really looked, the way he hadn't in months. I was rinsing dishes. I didn't turn around. "You hungry?" I asked. "I saved you a plate." He said nothing for a moment, then, "Sure, thanks." He didn't suspect anything yet, but Patricia had planted a seed. Meanwhile, I had hired someone, a private investigator named Ben Holloway, who came recommended by Margaret and who operated, as she put it, entirely within legal boundaries, but very close to the edge of them. He was a compact man in his 40s who wore unremarkable clothes and had the kind of face you forgot immediately after seeing it. He met me in a coffee shop in Decatur, and I gave him what I had: the Charlotte discrepancy, the cologne, the general timeline of Derek's behavioral change. Ben came back to me in 11 days. I was at my office when he texted, "Package ready, your call." I left work early and drove to his office in a strip mall off Ponce de Leon. He handed me a manila envelope without ceremony. I opened it at his desk. The photographs were dated over a 4-month period. Derek and Courtney Briggs. I recognized her from the Mercer Capitol holiday party 2 years ago. Auburn hair, sharp laugh, photographed outside a restaurant in Virginia Highland, entering a hotel near the airport twice, once in November, once in January. There were also phone records, legally obtained through a third-party service that cross-referenced public data, showing the volume and pattern of contact, dozens of calls, messages that followed a pattern inconsistent with professional communication. Late evenings, early mornings, weekends. I sat in Ben Holloway's office in a strip mall off Ponce de Leon Avenue, and I looked at proof of my husband's affair, and I felt something settle in me, like sediment dropping to the bottom of a glass. It was the Charlotte conference photograph that hit hardest. Derek in a hotel lobby, laughing, Courtney beside him with her hand at the small of his back. The same weekend he had texted me, "Long day, going to bed early, miss you, miss you." I put the photographs back in the envelope. I thanked Ben. I drove to Margaret's office and sat across from her at that same clean glass desk and placed the envelope between us. She opened it. She reviewed the contents methodically, without expression. Then she looked up. "This is enough," she said. "I know," I said. She picked up her pen. "The papers are ready. We can file Monday." And I said, "Let's file Monday." I drove home that evening through Atlanta rush hour traffic, the city golden and loud around me, and I thought about Courtney Briggs's hand at the small of my husband's back. I thought about the DNA test he had demanded. I thought about the child growing inside me, his child, whatever he believed. And I thought, he asked me for a test to protect himself. He had no idea he'd handed me the one thing that would make everything I'm about to do completely unassailable. He had wanted evidence. Fine. We would deal in evidence. Derek was served on a Tuesday morning. I had arranged it carefully with Margaret. The process server, a woman which Margaret said tended to go slightly better in these situations, marginally less likely to trigger an immediate physical escalation, arrived at Mercer Capitol at 10:15 a.m. while Derek was in a meeting. She waited in the lobby. He came out at 10:40. She handed him the envelope, confirmed his identity, and left. He called me 4 minutes later. I was at my desk at the publishing house, door closed. I let it ring twice before I answered. "What is this?" His voice was tight in a way I had never heard before. Controlled anger, the kind that comes just before the control breaks. "Rachel, what did you do?" "I think the documents are self-explanatory, Derek." "You filed for divorce? Without saying a word to me? Without one conversation?" "You asked me for a DNA test," I said, "over dinner, while I was telling you I was pregnant. I think that was the conversation." A long silence. "I want to talk about this tonight. Face to face." "You can talk to Margaret Ussie," I said. "Her contact information is in the filing." I hung up. My hands were not entirely steady, but they were steady enough. I sat for a moment at my desk, looking out at the Atlanta skyline through the office window, and then I opened my email and went back to work. There was a manuscript due for review by end of week. Life continued. He came home that evening, and it was not a conversation. It was something louder than that. Derek moved through the house in a state I had never seen from him. Not quite rage, because Derek had always kept his anger close to his chest, but something destabilized, something that had lost its footing. He demanded to know how long I'd been planning it. He demanded to know who I'd talked to. He accused me of trying to destroy him, of scheming behind his back, of using the pregnancy as a weapon. I stood in the kitchen and I let him speak. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I said, when he finally stopped, "I'm going to stay with Dana for a few days while you get legal representation. Margaret will be in touch." I had already packed a bag. Patricia called the next morning at 7:30. I was at Dana's apartment in Midtown, drinking coffee on her small balcony, watching the city wake up below us. "Rachel." Her voice was the temperature of a February morning. "I think you should reconsider what you're doing." "Good morning, Patricia. You are carrying my son's child." "That's what I've been saying," I said pleasantly. A pause. Then the warmth dropped entirely from her voice. "I know people, Rachel. People who can make certain proceedings very uncomfortable for a woman in your position. You are an editor at a mid-size firm. You have a salary, a rented parking space, and a lawyer paid for by what, exactly? You cannot afford a war with my family." I looked out at the Atlanta skyline. A hawk was circling somewhere above the buildings. "Patricia," I said, "I have photographs of your son in a hotel with Courtney Briggs. I have phone records. I have a signed, notarized filing in Fulton County Superior Court. I have a pregnancy that, when the DNA test your son requested comes back, will confirm paternity. And I have a lawyer who has not lost a case in 4 years." Silence. "I suggest," I said, "that Derek find good representation." I ended the call. Dana was watching me from the doorway with wide eyes and a coffee mug. "Was that who I think it was?" she asked. "Yes. And you just—" "Yes." She handed me a refill. "Rachel Calloway," she said quietly, "you terrify me." I laughed, genuinely, for the first time in weeks. It wasn't a triumphant laugh or a cruel one. It was just laughter, the kind that means you are still breathing, still here, still standing. I spent the next 4 days at Dana's. I slept. I took long walks through Piedmont Park in the early mornings before the heat built. I ate real meals. I read a novel, a thing I hadn't done purely for pleasure in months. I let the baby move in the growing quiet of my body, and I talked to it quietly at night about nothing important, about the park, about what Atlanta looked like from Dana's balcony at 6 in the morning. I needed those 4 days. The next phase was going to require everything I had. The first attempt at reconciliation came from Derek directly, and it arrived, of all places, in a letter. Not a text, not an email. An actual letter, handwritten on personal stationery, slipped through Dana's mail slot on a Thursday afternoon. I recognized his handwriting from birthday cards, from grocery lists left on the counter, from a note he'd once tucked into my luggage before a work trip that read, "Come home safe. I'll be here." That note had lived in my desk drawer for 2 years. I sat in Dana's kitchen and I read what he'd written. He was sorry. He had panicked. He'd been under pressure at work. Enormous pressure, he said. And he had reacted in a way that was unforgivable, and he knew it. He loved me. He had always loved me. He was asking me to come home and talk, just talk, before we did anything that couldn't be undone. He didn't mention Courtney. He didn't address the hotel photographs or the phone records. He mentioned the baby once, near the end, and called it our baby. A conspicuous shift from 9 days ago, when it had been not my baby. He asked me if I remembered the trip we'd taken to Savannah for our 3rd anniversary. The inn with the porch. The way the light looked at 6 in the evening over the water. I read it twice. Then I folded it and put it in the folder I was keeping for Margaret. I did not hate him when I read it. That surprised me. I had expected anger or grief, or that particular bitterness that comes from being asked to forgive things that have not been honestly admitted. What I felt instead was a kind of clear-eyed sadness, the recognition that the man in this letter was real, that some part of what he had written was genuine, and that none of it changed anything. Because genuine regret and accountability are not the same thing. Because I panicked is not an answer. Because you do not spend 4 months in hotel rooms with a colleague and then explain it as workplace pressure. Dana read it after me, without asking permission. We had been friends for 11 years. Permission was a formality. And she set it down carefully on the table between us. "That's well written," she said. "His mother probably helped him," I said. Dana looked at me. "You think Patricia used to teach English," I said, "and Derek has never written me a letter in his life." Dana picked up her mug. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing," I said. "Margaret handles it." I was right about Patricia. 3 days later, she called again. Not the cold ultimatum of the first call, but something smoother, more measured. She had clearly recalibrated. She asked if she could meet me for coffee. Just the two of them, she said, woman to woman. She suggested a place in Buckhead, neutral territory. I told her I'd think about it. I told Margaret instead. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Don't meet her alone," she said, "but you don't have to meet her at all. Patricia Hayes has no legal standing in this proceeding. She's a private citizen trying to manage her son's disaster. The fact that she's calling you directly tells me Derek's attorney has told him the filing is solid and they're looking for back channels." "So they're worried," I said. "They should be," Margaret said. What gave me the most unexpected support during those days was a phone call from Dr. Sandra Webb, my OB-GYN. She had read the notes from my last 2 appointments. I had mentioned, somewhat obliquely, during a prenatal visit in February, that I was experiencing significant stress at home related to trust issues in my marriage. She had documented it as she always documented everything, precisely and in full. She called to check in, and when I told her what had happened, the accusation, the filing, the DNA test request, she was quiet for a moment. "Rachel," she said, "I want you to know that everything you've told me in this office over the last year is in your file. The stress disclosures, the dates, the context." I understood what she was telling me. "Is that significant?" I asked. "Medical records are admissible in family court proceedings under certain circumstances," she said carefully. "I'm not an attorney, but I think you should tell Margaret about our conversations." I called Margaret immediately after. She was silent for 3 seconds when I told her, which was the Margaret Osei equivalent of pumping her fist. "That," she said, "is exactly what I needed." Dana took me to dinner that evening at a quiet Italian place in the old 4th Ward, and over pasta, she said something I had needed to hear. "You know what I keep thinking about?" she said. "He looked at you across that dinner table, a table you set for him, a meal you made for him. And the first thing he felt when you told him you were having his baby was suspicion. That's not a man who made a mistake. That's a man who was already somewhere else." I looked at her across the table. "I know," I said. "You're going to be okay," she said. "You and that baby are going to be more than okay." I believed her. Not in a reckless way, not in the way you believe something because you need it to be true, in the way you believe something because the evidence supports it. I was organized. I had documentation. I had a lawyer who didn't lose. I had a best friend who showed up. I had a doctor who had been paying attention. And I had a DNA test pending, requested by my husband himself, that was going to give me exactly the result I had never doubted. Let him request it. Let him believe, for a little while longer, that it was his advantage. It wasn't. They came on a Saturday morning without calling. I heard the knock while I was eating breakfast. Dana had already left for a yoga class, and I looked through the peephole, and there they were. Derek in a gray jacket, hands in his pockets, not meeting the door directly. Patricia beside him, composed, dressed as though she were going to church, holding what appeared to be a leather portfolio. They had not come for a conversation. They had come prepared. I should not have opened the door. I knew that even as I opened it. Rachel. Patricia's voice was warm in a way I recognized as performance. Thank you for letting us in. I hadn't said they could come in, but she moved forward as she spoke, and I stepped back. And suddenly they were in Dana's living room, and the power of the moment had been quietly reorganized. Derek sat on the couch. He looked tired, genuinely tired, with the kind of exhaustion that comes from not sleeping rather than from working. He looked at me with something I recognized as real feeling, and I kept my expression neutral and sat across from them in Dana's armchair, like I was interviewing them for a position I hadn't posted. Patricia opened the portfolio. Inside was a document. A proposed private settlement agreement, she explained, prepared by Derek's attorney but reviewed by a mediator. She walked me through it with the methodical calm of a teacher presenting a lesson. The house would be sold. I would receive 55% of the proceeds. Derek would voluntarily acknowledge paternity upon DNA confirmation and establish a structured child support arrangement. I would receive a lump sum payment described as transitional support. In exchange, I would withdraw the current filing and agree to an uncontested dissolution. It sounded, on paper, almost reasonable. Almost. The transitional support amount, I said, looking at the figure on page 3. That's below what Georgia guidelines would produce through court. Patricia smiled. It accounts for the speed and privacy of the resolution. Litigation is expensive and public, Rachel. This is cleaner for everyone. Cleaner for Derek, I thought. Quieter. Faster. Before any more documentation enters the public record. And the infidelity, I said. The photographs, the phone records, where do those figure in? Patricia's smile didn't waver. Those are allegations. They're documentation, I said. A silence. Derek leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Rachel. His voice was low. I know I hurt you. I know I said something unforgivable that night. I've made mistakes. I'm not going to sit here and pretend otherwise. But we have a baby coming. Whatever I've done, that's still true. And a court case isn't going to be good for you or for the pregnancy or for... Derek, I said, do not use this pregnancy to make an argument for sparing yourself. He stopped. Patricia shifted in her seat. I watched her recalibrate in real time. Rachel. She changed the register. Softer now, almost maternal. And it was so practiced, so precisely calibrated to what she thought I needed, that I felt something in me go very cold. You are going to be a mother, a single mother if you pursue this. I know you're angry and you have every right to be. But Derek is the father of this child. His family is this child's family. Do you really want to cut all of that away? For what? For a principle. For an equitable settlement based on 6 years of contributions to a joint life, I said, and for the acknowledgement, on record, that your son was unfaithful during this marriage. No one needs to know, I need to know, I said, and so does the court. Patricia closed the portfolio. The warmth left her face entirely, and I saw the version of her that had always been underneath, controlled, strategic, accustomed to winning. She stood. Derek stood a moment later, following her lead as he always did. "You're making a very serious mistake," she said. Not a warning, a statement of fact delivered from altitude. "I'll let Margaret know you came by," I said. They left. I locked the door and stood in Dana's living room and breathed. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the sustained effort of holding steady under pressure for 45 minutes, which takes something out of you regardless of how prepared you are. I sat back down in Dana's armchair and I let myself feel it. The fear that she had wanted to plant, the image she had constructed, single mother, alone, fighting a long legal battle against a family with resources. The fear was real. I won't pretend it wasn't, but here is what I have learned about fear. It is not the same thing as a reason to stop. Sometimes fear is information. Sometimes it tells you exactly what the other side is afraid of losing. And the more pressure they apply, the more you understand how strong your position actually is. Patricia Hayes had come in person on a Saturday morning with a leather portfolio and a pre-drafted settlement because Margaret's filing had hit something real. They were managing damage. They were offering me less than I was owed because they believed I could be frightened into taking it. They had badly miscalculated. I picked up my phone and texted Margaret. They came in person. I have the settlement documents. Call when you can. Then I texted Dana. When you get back, I'll tell you everything. Bring coffee. Then I sat in the quiet apartment and I let the fear finish moving through me. And when it was gone, what was left behind was something cleaner and harder, and entirely my own. I was not going to settle. The DNA results came on a Wednesday. Margaret called me at 8:50 in the morning and said very simply, "Come to my office." Not because the results were bad, because she wanted me to receive them with counsel present and a clear head. That was the kind of lawyer she was. I drove to Midtown through early traffic, parked in the building garage, and took the elevator to the 14th floor. Margaret was already at her desk, the sealed envelope from the lab in front of her. Her assistant had made coffee. The Atlanta skyline was very clear through the window behind her. She handed me the envelope. I opened it. The results were what I had known they would be. 99.998% probability of paternity. Derek Hayes was the father. I sat with that piece of paper for a moment. I thought about the dinner table, the candle, the braised short ribs. I thought about the look on his face when he'd said, "That's not my baby." That cold, immediate doubt lobbed at me like it weighed nothing. And I thought, he will have to say those words in a courtroom now and then hear these numbers read back to him by a judge. Margaret watched me. "How do you feel?" "Ready," I said. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later in Fulton County Superior Court. Margaret had filed a comprehensive complaint, dissolution of marriage on grounds of adultery, equitable division of marital assets, and a petition for sole legal decision-making authority pending a formal parenting plan, given Derek's denial of paternity and documented deception during the marriage. Derek's attorney, a man named Fuller, smooth and expensive, had countered with a motion to limit the admissibility of the surveillance evidence and a claim that significant premarital assets had been commingled and should be reclassified. They had also filed a character witness affidavit from Courtney Briggs, of all people, stating that Derek had confided to her that Rachel had been emotionally withdrawn and uninterested in the marriage for over a year. It was, from a strategic standpoint, a bold move. It was also the kind of move that only makes sense if you don't know what the other side is holding. We let it stand. The morning of the hearing, I wore a dark blue dress and low heels, the kind of outfit that says professional and composed without trying too hard. I met Margaret in the courthouse lobby, and she looked at me and said, "Just like we practiced. You answer what is asked, nothing more." "I know," I said. "And Rachel?" She paused. "When the numbers come in, don't react. Let the room do the work." The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. Wood paneling, fluorescent light, the smell of coffee from somewhere down the hall. Derek came in with Fuller and Patricia, who had no legal standing to be there in any official capacity, but had apparently been permitted to attend as a supporting party. She was dressed carefully, silver hair perfect, and she looked at me once across the room with the expression of someone who believes she is in control of the outcome. She wasn't. Margaret's presentation was methodical and devastating. She entered the surveillance documentation, the photographs, the hotel records, the phone record analysis, without drama, simply as evidence, item by item. She entered Dr. Sandra Webb's medical records documenting my disclosures of marital stress over 14 months, with dates and clinical notations that corresponded precisely to the timeline of Derek's affair. She entered the DNA test results, requested, she noted for the record, by Derek Hayes himself. Fuller objected to the admissibility of the phone records. The judge, the Honorable Claire Mendenhall, a woman in her 60s with half-moon reading glasses and a reputation for impatience with unnecessary theater, reviewed the chain of custody documentation, overruled the objection, and moved on. Then Margaret called Derek to the stand. Fuller had prepared him. He was composed, controlled, speaking in the measured tones of a man who is rehearsed. He acknowledged the affair, but framed it as the consequence of a deteriorating marriage. A desperate act, he said, by a man who had felt alone for over a year. He acknowledged requesting the DNA test, but said he had been acting under genuine uncertainty given the state of the relationship. Margaret let him finish. Then she approached. "Mr. Hayes, you testified that you requested a DNA test because you had genuine uncertainty about paternity. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And can you describe the state of your marriage at the time your wife made the pregnancy announcement?" "We were distant. We had been for some time." "Were you, at any point during that period of distance, physically intimate with your wife?" A pause. Fuller shifted. "Yes," Derek said. "Regularly." "Yes. So your uncertainty regarding paternity was not based on any physical impossibility." Fuller. Objection, argumentative. Judge Mendenhall. Overruled. Answer. Derek. "No, it wasn't." Margaret turned to the bench and presented the DNA results. She read the figure into the record. She asked Derek if he understood what the figure meant. He said yes. She asked him if he had anything to say to the court about his statement to his wife, made in their shared home at a dinner table she had prepared, that her child was, in his words, not his. The courtroom was very quiet. Derek looked at the table in front of him. "I was wrong," he said. He said it the way you say something when you have finally run out of alternatives, not with remorse, with the exhausted resignation of a man who is lost. Patricia, from her seat in the gallery, started to speak. Some interjection, some attempt to redirect, and Judge Mendenhall silenced her with a single, flat, "Ma'am, you are here as a spectator." Patricia went still. The ruling came 14 days later in a written decision that Margaret called me to read aloud. Equitable division in my favor, 62% of marital assets given Derek's documented marital misconduct, child support at the Georgia statutory rate, legal decision-making authority granted to me pending a formal co-parenting evaluation. Derek's motion to reclassify premarital assets was denied, as the documentation showed consistent commingling over 6 years. And a note in the ruling, brief but clear. The court found Derek's initial denial of paternity, made without factual basis, to be relevant context in assessing his credibility as a co-parenting partner going forward. Margaret read me that part twice. I was standing in my new apartment, a 2-bedroom in Inman Park that I'd signed the lease on 2 weeks earlier, and outside my window, Atlanta was moving through its regular Tuesday afternoon, indifferent and loud and entirely unchanged. Everything had changed. Derek did not appeal. Fuller had apparently told him, with the directness that expensive lawyers use when the bill is running long, that an appeal on these facts had no viable grounds and would extend costs without altering outcome. Derek accepted this. I heard it from Margaret, who heard it from Fuller's office in the form of a procedural notification. That was the last contact between our legal teams on the matter of contesting the ruling. The asset division took 6 weeks to execute. The house in Buckhead sold quickly. It was a good property in a good neighborhood, and the market was cooperative. My 62% came to substantially more than I had estimated when I'd first sat across from Margaret in her office 8 months earlier. It was enough for the down payment on a home in Inman Park, the 2-bedroom I'd been renting since I left Dana's, a neighborhood of old trees and front porches, and Saturday morning farmers markets 2 blocks away. I put in an offer the week after the sale closed. The investment accounts were divided according to the court order. Derek's attorney tried once more to reclassify a portion of a brokerage account he claimed had originated from a premarital inheritance. Margaret submitted the original account documentation showing that the inheritance funds had been deposited into a joint account in 2020 and had been invested jointly since then. The reclassification motion was denied at the administrative level without needing to go back to Judge Mendenhall. Derek was required to pay Margaret's fees, in part, as a consequence of the misconduct finding. That had not been something I'd planned for. Margaret had included it in the complaint almost as a formality, and it had stuck. He paid them. I imagine it was a difficult check to write. At Mercer Capital, things deteriorated. I did not cause this, and I want to be precise about that. I made no calls, sent no emails, contacted no one at his firm. What happened was a consequence of the public court record, which in Fulton County is accessible to anyone who looks, and which someone apparently did look at. A senior partner at the firm, according to Dana, who had a contact in that world. The affair with Courtney Briggs was documented in those records. Mercer Capital had a conduct policy. Courtney Briggs had been an employee under Derek's indirect supervision. There were conversations. There were HR processes. I don't know the precise outcome, but I know Derek was not in the same role at Mercer Capital by the time my daughter was 3 months old. Yes, my daughter. Ellie was born in August in the middle of a heat wave at Piedmont Atlanta Hospital with Dana holding my left hand and Dr. Webb managing the delivery with her characteristic efficiency. She weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces, and she had Derek's forehead and my mother's eyes, and she screamed immediately and without reservation, which Dr. Webb said was an excellent sign. I held her. And I thought about all the ways this moment had almost been ruined. By doubt, by someone else's guilt repackaged as suspicion. By a dinner table accusation designed to preempt rather than inquire. I thought about the night I'd sat alone in the dark kitchen and let myself feel the full weight of what was happening, and how from that darkness I had built, piece by piece and document by document, the case for my own life. The DNA test, I thought. He asked for it himself. That was, in the end, the detail I kept returning to. Derek had demanded a DNA test to protect himself. To establish, he must have imagined that the child wasn't his, and therefore that he bore no obligation. What the test had done instead was confirm paternity, enter the public record, and become the centerpiece of a legal case in which every subsequent document, the affair evidence, the medical records, the financial disclosures, could be arranged around that original demand. He had handed Margaret the narrative structure of the case. He had made the DNA test the instrument of his own legal defeat without understanding what he was doing. "Be careful what you ask for," my grandmother used to say. "You might get the truth." Patricia called once after the ruling. I did not answer. She left a voicemail that lasted 4 minutes, which I saved and sent to Margaret, who said it was legally irrelevant but personally satisfying. I agreed on both counts. There were no compromises. There were no softened endings, no private agreements made outside the court record, no moments where I looked at Derek across a table and felt something dissolve in me and decided to give something back. Life is not structured to reward you for those impulses. I had given 6 years to this marriage in full honesty. I had kept the house, managed the finances alongside him, built something I believed was real. When it ended on the record, with numbers and dates and a judge's written opinion. That was what I had. That was enough. I closed the door on the Buckhead Colonial for the last time on a Friday in early October. The movers had taken everything that was mine 2 days earlier. What was left in the house was neutral. Derek's things, the furniture we hadn't divided, the walls. I stood in the empty kitchen for a minute. I looked at the table where he'd said those words to me, then I left. The house in Inman Park had a porch. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked through it the day I made the offer, and it was the reason, if I'm being honest, that I made the offer at all. A deep front porch with white railings and 2 old crepe myrtles in the yard, the kind of trees that go spectacular in late summer, the kind of porch where you can sit in the evening with something cold to drink and watch the neighborhood move. I moved in on a Saturday in November with Dana and 2 of her cousins helping carry boxes. Ellie was 3 months old, sleeping in her car seat carrier through most of it, occasionally opening her eyes to survey the activity with what appeared to be measured skepticism. We ordered pizza when the boxes were in. We sat on the floor because the furniture wasn't arranged yet. Dana's cousin Marcus assembled Ellie's crib on the 3rd attempt. It was, without exaggeration, one of the best evenings of my life. The first year was not easy. I want to be honest about that because the story isn't useful if it pretends that winning a legal case resolves the practical weight of being a working single mother. I was back at the publishing house 6 weeks after Ellie was born. Derek exercised his parenting time on the schedule the court had established, and those handoffs were civil but cold, conducted mostly through text with the transactional courtesy of people who share an obligation but nothing else. But the house was mine. Ellie was mine. The mornings were mine. I would get up early before Ellie woke and sit on the front porch with coffee while Atlanta came to light around me. The crepe myrtles went dormant in winter and came back in spring dramatically, as if they'd never been gone. I started taking Ellie to the farmer's market on Saturdays. I started cooking again, not for anyone but us, and I found I was better at it without the anxiety of performance. 18 months after the ruling, I was promoted to editorial director. Margaret sent me flowers. Dana sent a voice memo of herself screaming with delight for approximately 45 seconds. I met someone the following spring, a structural engineer, recently divorced, no drama, a man who laughed easily and listened well and understood that Ellie came first without needing to be told. We took it slowly. We took it honestly. It was, in every way, different from what I had left behind. As for Derek, his position at Mercer Capital was eliminated in a restructuring that everyone understood was not voluntary. He found work eventually at a smaller firm, lower profile, lower compensation. I know this because the financial disclosures related to Ellie's support are reviewed periodically. I did not seek out this information. It arrived as paperwork. Courtney was gone within a year of the ruling. The relationship had not survived the courtroom. Not the photographs entered into evidence, not whatever conversations followed when the proceedings had made everything plain. She left Mercer Capital. I did not look further. Patricia had operated her entire adult life on the assumption that her authority extended to the boundaries of her son's world. What she had not accounted for was a woman who had simply stopped being manageable. I heard from Dana that Patricia had told people for months the divorce was Rachel's fault, Rachel's coldness, Rachel's unreasonableness. Some believed her. Over time, the story stopped mattering because Derek's circumstances became visible to everyone, and the public record is difficult to argue with. She attended Ellie's first birthday party, my decision made for Ellie's sake, and was perfectly correct throughout, the way people are when they know they no longer hold the stronger hand. Ellie walked at 14 months. She was speaking in 2-word sentences by 16. She had a laugh that started somewhere deep and arrived like a surprise. Every evening when I came home, she ran to the door to meet me. I had left a dinner table where I'd been accused of the most basic betrayal a spouse can imagine, and I had built, from that table outward, a life so completely different that I sometimes sat on my porch in the evening and had difficulty connecting the woman I was now to the woman who had stood in that kitchen and said, "Okay, sweetheart," with a smile she'd had to construct. That woman had known what she was doing. I think she always had.